not going to announce it today. Yeah, if you see that website again, still in the tab.
That gets translated into all kinds of ways. It's not just gay marriage. It's like when I'm gay bashed across the
CW for heard and saw a little bit of them. It was like George Bush had stolen a little bit from Lord of the Rings. Oh yeah. One, no, it was like he said something about one hope, one thing, one hope to bind us, and I was like, that is such a ripoff. Was he reaching out, trying to make it more? Yeah, this was like there's one America, one election, one America Constitution. Clearly conservative. Clearly has no room for this one's free. Lincoln's election. What? Lincoln's election is the thing to talk about. What? Like the South split their voters in this count for one candidate.
Do you think we're going to have secession? In the South? I don't know. I've heard that before. I think Lincoln was not the hero. I'm not so sure he was the hero. Maybe he could have prevented that terrible war, but I wonder if anybody's going to talk about it. I heard Seymour Hersh, you know him. Seymour Hersh, he spoke at Faneuil Hall last Friday night, and he talked before the election. So he talked about the possibility of, and I can't remember the words, insurrection or whatever. I he wasn't sure whether that would happen if Bush won or if Kerry won because the people are so polarized. And then at one point he said, I don't know if he said he was going to do it, if he recommended it, but he said, I'd sell short and move to Italy.
I've got friends talking about that.
What?
I have friends talking about that.
I'd like to hear people talk. I'm not going to ask a question, but I'd like to hear some question about whether there is the possibility of some major secession, revolution, civil war, riots, maybe something milder. I don't know what. Are you a student here? Are you?
No, I'm on staff here, and my brother, so I brought him along.
I have asked. I'm a chemical engineer from MIT. I come here a lot. On a couple of occasions I ask questions, and I'm reluctant to ask a question because I've only asked questions when there's nobody else asking questions, which is rare. But sometimes the place is not full at all. But I'd love to hear somebody bring up some serious issues, you know. On the other hand, well, in fact, if you listen to what Bush and Kerry both had to say, I heard them speak. Did you hear them speak?
Yeah.
Kerry around the
They
world.
both were talking about the peaceful
Reconciliation.
process.
Exactly. They're emphasizing it as though it's on their mind. Kerry says he wants his voters, you know, people who supported him to become, whatever, peaceful. They both use the same phrase. Well, they had a 5-minute conversation as if they organized the thinking. And then Bush came out and said, and now I'd like to speak to the people who voted against me. I'm going to do everything I can. You didn't hear it, but this is to serve you, to, you know, unify. But it seems to me that even if you can unify a majority of the opposition, and both sides are opposition, a minority of either group can raise hell.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, it's too bad you guys aren't the ones to ask the question. I'd like to
So what are you doing at MIT?
I am an alumnus of MIT.
Oh, yeah.
I work in semiconductors. You know anything about semiconductors?
No, but this guy might. He's a fellow alum of MIT. So.
In what field? You what?
I have friends that like applied materials and stuff like that.
Well, that's not really chemical engineering. That's a whole part of it. Material science.
Well, yeah, my friends do process engineering.
In the semiconductor school? School, yeah. In chemical, they do deal with that semiconductor now in chemical engineering, but I started work in semiconductor fabrication in 1960 when 4 transistors on a chip was state of the art. Now 64 million is state of the art. But it always amazed me that MIT chemical engineering were very slow to get involved in semiconductor technology. Now they're in it, but this is chemical engineering. You know, most people think it's electrical engineering, but fabricating integrated circuits is total chemical engineering. It's wet chemistry, crystal growth, evaporation, etching, diffusion, pure chemical engineering. I worked at General Telephone for a while. We had 100 chemical engineers and 4 electricals. So anyway. But I now take courses in international relations. In fact, I'm taking a course right now at BU. They have a program for people over 65. You take graduate seminars, are very inexpensive, on the media and the president. I took it this year. They give the course every year, but I figured this is the year to take it.
Yeah.
Tomorrow we'll talk about the election, I'm sure. So what do you guys make of the election? Are you local from Boston area?
Well, he's out in San Francisco.
And then you're a Democrat too.
Yeah. And I live in Belmont.
I'm a gold-water conservative. I have always been. And I've been living in Massachusetts for 60 years.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it used to be dangerous back in the days of Kennedy. But not literally, there were times when I thought people were going to slug me for saying what I thought. Now, it's become a very respectable approach. In fact, I think a lot of the left-wing radicals wish we had Goldwater conservatism. And I worry about working as much as, not me, not much, but that's not conservative.
While everybody's hooking up, perhaps I'll go ahead and get started and welcome all of you here to this conversation. There was a sense just in the last couple of days that that elections, especially one of this intensity and importance, it provides a real teaching moment, and it's worthwhile to have a conversation just among family here within the Kennedy School about what we've just seen and what it means and where it's going, and that's the occasion that brings us together. And fortunately, we have on the faculty outstanding individuals who both have come from an academic background as well as come from the arena and can bring to this conversation insights that will be, I think, very helpful for all of us in trying to get our hands around what this has been. I know it's been an evening for some of you of jubilation. And we congratulate those of you who are working for the Republicans, that you've been working very hard, and you deserve to be congratulated for a clean victory. At the same time, I know some of you were working your hearts out on the other side, and there's a great despondency today, almost a sense of loss in the family. And this is a day when people are really trying to come to grips with a melancholy, a mourning, if you'd like, that is pretty profound. And so it's worthwhile having a chance to talk about that here. Briefly, you know our four panelists. I'll spare you long introductions. Elaine Kmark will be joining us momentarily, but Steve Goldsmith, to my immediate left, served a couple of terms as mayor of Indianapolis, earned a reputation as one of the most innovative mayors in the country. We're fortunate to have him here as a professor of practice. Professor, what is your firm title these days? You're about to get a named chair, too. Is that?
Professor practice will do for now.
For right now, okay. But he also served as the chief domestic policy advisor to the Bush-Cheney campaign 4 years ago, and he's chair of the Corporation for National and Community Service and special advisor to the president on faith-based initiatives. He's been a major driving force in trying to preserve and extend the national service movement among young people. Maxine Isaacs, to his left, has someone with long experience in the arena. On the other side, in her case, she's here on the faculty, of course, and teaches a very popular course on American politics, and has been so, I think, devoted to students and taking them into New Hampshire during primaries and making sure that they're exposed to some of the most interesting people in politics. She worked as press secretary and deputy campaign manager in the 1984 Mondale campaign. She is, I think it's fair that she's also had a special perch for this election. Jim Johnson, her husband, was the man who, working for John Kerry, ran the selection process for the vice presidency. And was very intimately involved in the early thinking about a transition. So we appreciate you being here, Maxine, as well. Alex Jones, you've heard here on this at these forums on many occasions and you know about his background with the New York Times for some 11 years, the book that he wrote, which the trust. On the family behind the New York Times. He's currently director of the Shorenstein Center here and has been a wonderful citizen for us. And Phil Sharp, as you know, represented as a congressman from the state of Indiana as a Democrat in the House from 1975 to 1995. Was very involved in passing the last energy bill, the Energy and Policy Act, and is now part of a national commission which is considering energy, and you're going to be issuing your report in December.
December 8th.
Yeah, it's December 8th. And was the director of the Institute of Politics and graciously and generously agreed to come back and serve as acting director of the Institute during this time when Dan Glickman left us. And we've been most appreciative of your service there, and it's been a welcome presence there. And Elaine will be joining us shortly, and perhaps I can wait on the introduction. Now, okay, let's get to the conversation. Perhaps let me start with you, Steve. I'd like to find out from you how it happened, but let me just, we talked about this before we came out. The magnitude of what happened last night. I must tell you that the victory on the Republican side not only was extraordinarily different from the exit polls that caused such an emotional euphoria on the Democratic side as the day built up and then put everybody on a roller coaster the rest of the night. But I think it was, the outcome was dramatically different from what anybody anticipated, even without the exit polls. That when a president of the United States goes from a 500,000 vote deficit and then comes back with a 3.5 million vote popular victory, that's dramatic. And he's the first president in history who lost the popular vote the first time out and then was reelected the next time out. And he's, of course, the Senate victories for the Republicans, a sweep in the South. No one anticipated they'd get all 5 of those Democratic seats, plus winning South Dakota, which we'll get into will have a big impact on the Senate, picking up additional 4 seats, moving from 51-49 to 55-45, and then picking up seats in the House. I think that we will look back and say this victory was not only a significant victory, it may have been an historic victory. We don't know that yet, it's too early. A lot depends on what happens. But the president and others, first words out of Dick Cheney's mouth today, mandate. Mandate. Important to understand. You'll notice frequently, everybody else says nice things, Cheney cuts to the heart of what they think. So my question to you, Steve Goldsmith, is how did it happen and what do you make of it?
Well, I think there's different ways to answer that, David. At the one level, the Republican presidential baseline has continuously been going up for a couple decades or so. I mean, the numbers have been getting better. Secondly, you can look at the issues that people said they were concerned about who voted, and those who cared about terror, those who cared about leadership, and those who cared about moral values voted for the president in very large numbers. And of course, those who cared more about the economy voted for Senator Kerry in very large numbers. And so we see around the issue, the leadership issue trumped almost everything else in this particular campaign. So that's another way to look at it. A third way to look at it, of course, is that I think Republicans have finally gotten almost as good as Democrats in election day activities, this grassroots stuff that you've read so much about. In my experience, Phil and I were on opposite sides, not running against each other, but in Indiana, different political parties, and my experience has been that up until maybe 2 years ago, Republicans got beat on election day with the groundwork. And I don't think Republicans may have beat the Democrat operation this time, but I think they probably tied it, which had a big effect on a voter turnout. And whether people attribute that to get out the vote efforts, the missing evangelicals, all those things are an issue as well. Just 2 other quick observations. This is probably, if you look at who voted for the president, this is not a good forum for me to be at, because if you've gone on after college, right, you're what the pollers call a postgraduate, and if you don't go to a church or synagogue or mosque weekly, then your chances that you voted for the president are quite lower than if you fell in those other categories, right? So folks who are married, go to church, and college or less, particularly less, fell in a group that voted for the president. So we do find pretty substantial demographic differences. Last comment, which may be my least popular. I don't know that it's fair to say, if you look at America, that there's some far-right phenomena. If 11 out of 11 states have substantial margins on banning gay marriage, if substantial numbers of individuals are anxious about partial right abortion, partial birth abortion, it may very well say that, that the bulk of America is concerned about those issues in a way that the president's leadership brings them out in intense numbers. They care about those issues. They identify them now more with the Republican Party. The changing baseline for Catholic vote is very significant. You know, a hardcore over the years Democrat constituency that now is somewhat Republican, not hugely Republican. So I think the moral issues are important, and I don't think they can just be attributed to a slice of the evangelicals.
It was interesting, Steve, on the exit polls. It's hard to know how much faith to put in these exit poll numbers, obviously, but in the final tallies of the exit polls, when people were asked what was the most important issue in this election, moral values was number one, above terrorism, above Iraq, above jobs. And in the group that said moral values were number one, went overwhelmingly for President Bush. Now, was that driven in part by putting the same-sex marriage ban up for a vote in 11 states, including Ohio? Do you think that made a significant difference? The Democrats always thought that stem cell research was their sort of, quiet ace in the hole. But was it the same-sex marriage actually, in the end, make a much bigger difference than people thought?
I think it made a very big difference when you're doing 60 and 70% majorities in 11 states. I think Senator Kerry, although his position on this was within the mainstream, if you will, the fact that the issue actually started in Massachusetts. He's a senator from Massachusetts. I think it was easy, and that the president was very strong on these issues. I think the gay marriage amendments were symbolic as well as substantive, and they, coupled with the view that the president is kind of upright and strong and unwavering on these issues. Those two things together, I think, were very motivating. And I think that just finally, this issue you mentioned, that the number one issue was moral values, and people who put that as the number one issue were like 80% for the president. It was very important in this election.
Yeah. Maxine, I want to ask you, please, all of you, please feel free to engage with what the other person says. Yeah, Phil, just go ahead.
To challenge that a little bit, I think that's a question of what language people utilize. And that's why I'd be a little careful about where the future of either party goes on this issue, is because I suspect that many people who had a strong view of the war could have answered that as moral values, but they were focused on the war. In other words, their condemnation of the war has to do with their morality and their moral values, or economic justice.
Yeah. I think there's another point about this, which is that it's sort of statistical. Moral values
That's right.
was. Am I not connected?
I think you are.
Moral values was the most important issue for the electorate as a whole, but Bush got more votes among that electorate. So the moral values among the Bush electorate was the highest. Iraq, which you didn't mention when you were talking about the questions that were motivating voters, was almost as high among Democrats. And so when you say moral values was the most important issue in the election, that's because that was among the group that won the election. So that there's a statistical, what I think is a more interesting question is that there's an asymmetry in the dialogue and among the voters, because the voters that were motivated to come out for Bush were motivated by that set of issues, and the voters that were motivated to come out for Kerry were motivated by Iraq and some of the other issues. And so I think I think we sort of don't. We need to be more accurate about what we're saying about that particular statistic, which is also sort of tautological, because I'm a Kerry voter, and I'm against the war, so that's why I'm in the electorate. But that's not telling you very much.
It tells you quite a lot if the most important issue among all voters is moral values, and then you think about of the 51% who then voted for Bush. Then it's, of them, it's like for 40% of them or more, it's the most important issue. That's a very large statement about what got them to the polls.
80% of them.
Yes.
80% of the people who thought it was a top issue voted for Bush.
Yes.
That's
Yes,
what
and
they cited.
80% of
But that
those
was, in other words,
who thought
that was a
Iraq
major
was the
driver.
top issue voted for
Well,
Kerry.
I got to say, I think that I got to go with Steve on this. I think that this was a hugely powerful issue, and I don't particularly like the way it's framed as moral values, because I think that it suggests that if you're feeling one way, you're moral, and if you don't feel that way, you're not, which I certainly don't subscribe to. But I think that, let's just use that as shorthand for the moment. I think the most shocking thing I've seen in the media coverage to date was the article by Johnny Apple on the front page of the New York Times this morning, in which he was doing an analysis. This is a guy who's been doing this for many, many years. He was doing an analysis of who was voting for what and why. And he said in one sentence, and the only sentence that was devoted in the article to this subject, he said, and many, a surprising number of voters, an overwhelmingly large number of voters, listed moral values as an issue of very great concern, which is surprising since neither campaign really touched on these things very much, which suggests to me just how clueless the press has been about the idea and the importance of this subject, which has been there all along, but which has not been understood and has gotten sort of put into the background by all the noise about the economy and the war on terror in Iraq, when in fact this was something that was an enormously important issue all along, especially in the red states, and that we in the blue states, we in the media especially, really missed it.
Do you think that their quality of the press, many of whom would be identified as seculars, rarely going to church, I think that's more true of a lot of members
I don't
of the
think
press.
that was
Do you
really.
think that makes them a little tone deaf to
Maybe,
this issue?
but actually, I don't think that really was the main thing. I mean, that may have contributed. I think the main reason was that I think that the Bush campaign effectively did this in a way that was not something that got the attention of the Democratic Party, the Democratic campaign, or the media. They didn't make this the centerpiece of Bush's speeches, but they were in churches, they were organized, they went everywhere. They made this point again and again. The Democrats had Edwards going out and talking to people about economic inequality. The Republicans had surrogates going everywhere and preachers going everywhere talking about these issues in moral terms. And I think that was something, everyone was aware maybe that some of it was going on, but the power of it, this sort of current that was underneath the surface, I think, certainly got away from the media, and I don't think the Democrats really
I just
got it.
disagree. I think that people saw this all along. I think we saw it in the change in Kerry's behavior as they picked it up in the campaign trail. He began to speak more openly about his own religious background.
Started going to church.
Pardon me?
Started going to church on a pretty regular basis. In fact, he seemed to go 3 or 4 times a week.
Well, I think they said his first date with Teresa was at Mass. I don't remember. But my point is that they began to surface it because they began to recognize it, and I thought it was picked up in the press. I don't mean to underestimate its power. What I would argue is that for those who want to conclude something out of this election as the way to govern or the way to be the opposition party, they should be very careful. This has powerful symbolic value, but get specific with it, and suddenly you begin to divide. The president's position on stem cell research was taken for specific religious reasons advocated by specific religious groups, but it did not turn out to be a popular position to take. And get beyond the partial birth abortion to more serious reaches into the abortion issue, and I suspect the power of that is going to diminish very quickly.
Do you think the Democratic Party understands the power, the moral?
Well, I think some people do, and I think I have no doubt the next time around, anybody with any sense will understand it.
That's a question that I'd like to that I've been thinking
please.
about for the last few hours, and we talked about it a little bit at the Shorenstein Center earlier today. I think that well, let me back up. In my class on Tuesday, Tom Oliphant came to class, and we were talking about moral values, which is the way we all talk about this, and he said, hold it. He said, what you're calling moral values is for some people life itself. It's the way they organize their lives, it's their it's the main thing that motivates them. We're talking about how their families and their communities, and you know, by putting the name moral values on it, you're not even understanding what's going on there. And so I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, well, if that's true, which I'm sure it is, I have one of those myself. You know, I have those moral values too, but it's a different set. It's what we would have called liberal, traditional liberal, small L view. You know, that tolerance and embrace of diversity and yes, secularism and love of the arts and things like that. Maybe I don't know quite how you'd frame it, but that's my moral value. But we don't. That gets sort of that's considered sort of not parallel. Right. And so in our political dialogue, so what I'm saying is two things. One, I think that we would all benefit enormously from getting all of this stuff out of our political dialogue. Most of these questions that we're talking about can't be resolved in a political realm. You know, the partial birth abortion, stem cell research, some of these things are not the basis on which you can, I don't think that you can form the Democrats can form a political party that's going to be, that's going to make sense going forward.
Did you, I had the experience of talking to people today who sort of said, look, I woke up this morning feeling, these were Kerry people, I woke up this morning feeling as if this is a country that is now has a majority whose values are different from mine, and from whom I feel somewhat alienated, that I feel somehow some kind of emotional separation from. It's almost as if there's a club and I'm not a member of it.
But David, there's a huge judgment implied in the term moral values. Right. That I think that there are moral values and then there are immoral values. I mean, it would seem to me. I'm very curious to know where this term came from. I never heard that term in my memory during the campaign. Right. Was this the Matovsky exit polling that simply created that, or is this something like partial birth abortion or pro-choice, pro-life, that kind of thing, that is a captive expression now that is going to be owned by the Republican Party, and everybody who's not for moral values is over here somewhere else?
It goes back to the moral majority question, right?
Family values to moral values.
That's what I'm trying to say, Alex, because I'm trying to say, well, you know, if we're gonna pose the universe in those stark terms, then those of us who believe what we believe, we ought to be willing to insert those sets of views into the political dialogue. For example, let's get religion out of politics. You know, I mean, for starters. You know, and I think that there's if you're saying if these are organizing principles and these are our values, those values are as strong to me, David, as the values are that we're talking about that we're calling moral values.
Right, but what I would tell you is that there are a number of people where I come from in the South who would say, my politics are how I express my religious beliefs. Right. And asking me to get religion out of my politics is like, you don't even understand who I am. That you don't get sort of what matters to me.
But my politics is how I express my spiritual beliefs.
Yeah.
Right? So that why don't we find a way to talk about these things that is separate from our national politics? I mean, why can't we have a political party where we're dealing with?
I think you really got to divide the religious people up, and this is a mistake. First of all, the Democrats make a big mistake if they do not recognize that they must be respectful of and articulate that and be truthful about respectful for people who organize themselves with a religion. First of all, I think most Democrats do. So I think this is a fundamental. It is not something that is partisan, and the language is separating. Your issue about feeling out of it, first of all, it's a natural consequences of losing your election. I lost in 1970, 34 years ago, and after years of therapy and winning elections, I'm now over it. But it took 30 years, so just get over it at some point. But the real issue is that for years, one of the reasons that President Bush is successful with this issue is the mistake that some liberals and some Democrats, not all, made, which was in media or elsewhere to belittle those who had strong beliefs and who tried to organize them, or to try to keep it at such distance to say it's irrelevant. It is not irrelevant in anybody's life that has any caring about their life. The issue that you raise is how far to bring it in. But what I'm trying to suggest is those people, the president and others, will make a terrible mistake if they argue they have a mandate based on religious conviction, because suddenly they're going to discover very quickly that all of people of religious faith have sharply different views about public welfare, about abortion, about all of these issues.
Jump back into this.
And I don't think they're going to do it.
Number three.
Yeah, no. Help us understand. Yeah, but Steve, help us understand this, because I think you're someone who can interpret the Republican Party for people here in ways that I think it's really hard sometimes for people in this milieu to quite get it. And what's going on?
Well, your original question to me, David, was explain the election, not set out a governance. Well,
Right.
I mean, so I'm not suggesting that governance ought to be around who's the most religious. I mean, that's a dangerous place to go.
I don't think Bush is, by the way. I don't think they will do that.
But there are large numbers of Americans whose value system is embedded in their religious views, and they think that a person who is religious expresses a set of characteristics and characteristics that are similar to theirs. And all I'm saying is, and I actually believe that a fair number of independents and maybe many Catholics believe that in this campaign, the Democrat Party wasn't aligned with their particular value system, and that motivated them, whether they're evangelicals or whatever, it motivated them to vote in higher numbers. Now, that's different than saying wear it on our sleeve, have every vote be around it, but I think, Maxine, to the extent that your position is very reasonable, but I think it also will make it difficult for the Democrat Party to be a majority. And I think that's what, at least for the time being, what the vote yesterday shows.
You mean unless they're willing to concede the, basically their views to the religious right, they can't be a majority?
I don't think it's a religious right. I mean, President Clinton signed the charitable choice legislation, which was the first legislation that says that faith-based organizations should provide social services. When President Bush tried to expand the legislation that President Clinton signed, the Democrat Congress said no, it goes too far in favoring religion.
And didn't Kerry in this campaign, when he was asked what are some of the good ideas Bush has had, I think he singled out faith-based initiatives.
I think when Senator Kerry finally got around to my purpose here isn't to criticize Senator Kerry. It's just to say I don't think voters viewed Senator Kerry in the same place they viewed President Clinton on those issues, nor do they view the party, your party today, as in the same place that President Clinton was and when the DLC was more active. So I don't want to beat up on it very much. I just think it caused people to vote in exceptionally high numbers who care about those issues.
This is just a thought, and I believe it's the case, but it's yet to be tested. I think that you're right. These were obviously very important issues for this election. But I think it's very important to keep in mind that we have had a war without any costs. I don't mean it not literally, but I mean we've had no tax increase. Nobody's felt the pain there. We've had casualties, but we've not had overwhelming casualties, not remotely like Vietnam. We have had no draft. If the world should turn in such a way that taxes had to be increased, a draft had to be instituted, would, as in this election, these moral values trump those issues? I don't think so. I think that the thing is, these are important. I don't mean they're not important, but I don't think that means that they are the only thing that is important and are going to carry the day forever. So it really depends on how things shape up.
They will be cast in moral issue terms as to whether or not you're taking social and economic responsibility and what is your responsibility to society and our troops generally. They'll be cast as in terms of moral terms of life of soldiers.
I agree with that. I would have to argue with you, Alex, that in the event if serious sacrifice were asked of everyone, that could easily trump these kind of questions. But when a state like Ohio, which has had huge job losses, nonetheless vote for the president, you have to say to a significant degree there is evidence that some of these moral or these value questions trumped economics.
But David, if you look at
if people have voted to an increasing degree against what might be conceived or perceived as their economic interest.
Based on what I saw last night, I don't have the numbers, but the people who voted in Ohio for Kerry were people who had been touched directly or indirectly by that, and the people who didn't, for the most part, had not.
Yeah. But Bush won. If you divided the electorate up by people, by income, he won people $50,000 and up. He won 50 to 75, 75 to 100. Those are people who are feeling the middle class, so-called middle class squeeze.
Yeah, but they hadn't lost
They
their.
got it, go ahead.
No, but based on what I saw last
Yeah.
night, that group of people who voted, I mean, this is, who voted for who and who did not in Ohio.
Right.
And the people who were identified as the ones who voted for Kerry were ones who overwhelmingly had a relative, a personal experience, a family member, a friend, a direct connection with the economic, with the economic trauma of Ohio. But there are a lot of people in Ohio that it did not touch. And for the most part, those people put these other issues ahead. All I'm saying is, when you're touched by something that affects you directly, which a draft, for instance, would in a way that nothing else in this country probably would. I mean, if you want, for instance, one of the things it would have done was be to galvanize the youth vote that did not appear.
All I would say was this, we've got to go back to Steve's point. It used to be that Catholics and people who were in a middle class squeeze would vote Democratic on a regular basis. They're increasingly voting Republican, and there's something going on there that one has to deal with. The Democratic Party has to recognize is there's a stream of people leaving our party on non-economic grounds.
That's true.
And there's something else going on that we have to think
Why
about.
do you say there's a stream of people leaving the party? I mean, it seemed to me that...
Because this was the old coalition.
Well, the electorate was, the electorate was tied going into the election. Bush pulled away at the end. The feeling that you described of Democrats feeling totally rejected is I mean, it was a disappointment to lose that election. It was terrible, but it was basically
when you lose
a close
5 out of
election.
5 seats in the South,
Well,
you don't think there's a message
but
out of
it wasn't 1984, the election that I'm most familiar with. It wasn't 1972. It was a pretty close election. It was tied virtually tied to the end. It came down to one state. I mean, I think we can overplay the magnitude of rejection that the voters experienced. I just would really question that.
The states that keep losing, the states that are, I mean, if you play this out, it's kind of interesting. There's a lot of kind of pros and cons for each party, right? But the states that are traditionally Democrat states are population losing states. And the states that are gaining voters are generally leaning Republican. So now, the youth vote was more for Senator Kerry than it was for President Bush, and obviously African Americans are kind of 9-1, and Latinos, I think actually the president did reasonably well, but still lost. But if you look at the demographics of it, there's a kind of a confusing situation. But it would seem that if the Democrats' stronghold states are those losing population, that something's going to have to change in the mix going forward.
But that's a structural issue, right?
Yes.
That's not an ideological issue. So, I mean, it may play out in an ideological framework, but it's a structural issue.
Yeah.
I mean, Bush ended up with the same states that he'd won. He had 8 more electoral votes for starters.
Right, exactly.
Because of
Let
population
me ask you this.
shift.
Where do you think this leads? I'm going to go to the floor here in a minute. Where do you think this leads in the next 4 years, next 2 years with President Bush and the Republican Congress?
Well,
Do they have a mandate?
I wouldn't want to disagree with the vice president. Let me say a couple things. One, I do believe today the president was sincere in saying he wanted to govern across the aisle. He was very proud of that in Texas, and obviously we haven't done that. There hasn't been a lot of that the last couple of years, regardless of who you blame that on. And the majorities in the Senate in particular will allow the president to operate as if he has a mandate. Now, I think there are a couple substantial limitations here. And we'll see a lot of this play out, of course, in the next Supreme Court nominee, and that could really taint the waters in a way that are irreparable. The other thing I think will be very interesting is the economic issues. No matter which of these gentlemen won, the economic issues that they face, and now the president, are really serious issues, right? If you look at the Social Security deficit and the Medicare deficit and the cost of the war and the cost of all the other services and health care for the uninsured, it's going to take a bipartisanship across the aisles to accomplish that, and it's hard to imagine how that will, with the parties having totally different views about how those things should be reconciled. That's difficult. So my only comment is I think the president's sincere. I think the Republican senatorial majority and the fact that the Congress is, many people, particularly in the House, won based on very conservative agendas, will tend to aggravate the partisanship, as will the issues. And it'll be interesting to see if the president can kind of bridge across all of those
Will
things.
they read into the DeMint victory in South Carolina and the Coburn victory in Oklahoma in the Senate races that there's strong support out there for the kind of more conservative agenda that they represented?
Yes.
They will. So they've got the bit in their teeth now, in terms of what they think they have a mandate for moving forward vigorously.
I think that it's reasonable that the Republicans would conclude that their substantial majorities in Congress are directly related to their conservative philosophy.
This is the realignment they've been working for.
I mean, Steve, don't you think there will be some dispute within the Republican Party as to what is the mandate and what is the wise thing for the party to
Absolutely.
do to govern for the future? That's the point I'm getting back at. Is it's awfully easy to claim mandate the day after election, and there is one. There's a mandate for them to be the governing folks and to make the decisions. I would argue it's going to be a little less clear specifically what the mandate entails, and it never has been for Democrats.
You're just
if it is for Republicans.
Right. You're just used to me being an extremist. I'm not saying that this is
No, I
the
don't
way
think
we
you
should
are
go.
at all. I don't think. In fact, I think the president would have won much higher had he been in line with your views.
I was just suggesting, I don't think inconsistently with what you said, Phil, that I think the president will want to do more bipartisan responses to these serious issues. But I think that I mean, look what happened on the Medicare prescription drug bill, right? The more conservative members of the House were very ill at ease or upset, and now that the majorities are up based on relatively conservative elections that they would view as mandates in their particular districts, I think it'll make it more difficult for the president to accomplish this.
Phil, your long service in the House, will the Democrats feel, the Republicans have told me for some time, if we can knock off Tom Daschle in South Dakota, that's going to put a shot across the bow for the Democrats, and they're going to realize if you oppose us on a continuing basis, we will target you and we will knock you off. And they did that very intentionally. It was without precedent how they went into campaign against him, and they took him out. And their feeling was if we get Harry Reid in there, who's going now. Senator Dodd has apparently decided today he will not contest.
Did you say we won't?
He will not contest Reid's leadership in the Senate. That was just reported a few minutes ago. So it looks like Harry Reid will be the leader. They feel they can work with Reid, that he's a guy, he has a Lieberman-like quality, that they can work with him. Is the tendency, and what will Democrats do, and what should they do in order to seek their comeback? Should they cooperate with the president in a lot of ways now, or should they oppose him on every front, or should they sort of look for a couple of issues that can cooperate and a lot of issues on which they'll oppose him?
Well, they will behave both as Democratic and Republican opposition parties have behaved for the last 50 to 100 years in this country, in my view. In the House of Representatives, they will tend to be more in opposition because it's unlikely the Republican Party there as a majority will have any need or desire to try to, on big issues, compromise with Democrats.
Right. They'll just run it the way
they will make their. But in the Senate, it is inevitable that they must find compromise, and it may well be that Harry Reid's personality and approach will be such that that's easier. I would argue a little bit about their theory is somewhat mistaken, I think, by thinking by knocking off Daschle. Daschle was too liberal for the state to begin with. Usually party leaders are from an area in which they are more anchored in their own political party. So I think he was in some sense more vulnerable to that. My own advice to Democrats, what I always believe in the House of Representatives, just try to govern well. And sometimes you ought to be working and actively working. I think to go into strict oppositionism is a grand mistake for the political party. If it looks like, and my own judgment would be very damning of them, if it looks like they're just simply in opposition for opposition's sake, you better have a good reason not to find solutions.
If the first one of the first moves out of the box is Justice Rehnquist steps down, and let us say maybe someone we've never thought about before, Justice Scalia, were recommended or put forward as nominee. What would the Democrats do?
Well, I think that they will probably fight tooth and nail. The question will be for the president is, will all the moderate Republican senators, there are some, will they support that kind of a nomination, or will they find themselves, there were 6 Republican senators who voted against the energy bill for a variety of reasons. A number of them were the moderate things. Is that something that the Republican Party can tolerate in this instance? I don't know what their situation will be, but if it's clear that you're going to get somebody that's going to be against Roe versus Wade, you're going to have a major battle.
Great. Let's welcome Elaine Kmark to the stage. And Elaine, I have one question for you, and then I want to go to the floor as you're suiting up here. We have not talked about the change in the women's vote and how profound that was. The last time, 4 years ago, Al Gore won the women's vote by 11%. This year, Senator Kerry won the women's vote by 3%. A dramatic change, and some people believe that alone provided the margin for the president. And I know you've thought about this. Tell us about what happened with women and how much of an impact that had.
I think it's a very serious problem for the Democrats. We've been accustomed to having a net gender gap work in our favor in many elections, not just presidentially, but gubernatorial, Senate elections, et cetera. To have the women's vote, have the net gender gap advantage disappear, I think is a terrible problem. Now, when it shrunk in 2000, it shrunk among married women. There was a 6-point shrinkage from 1996, and that was pretty obvious. This was the elephant in the living room in the 2000 election, which was Bill Clinton's personal scandals. And not surprisingly, it turned off married women more than any other group in the population, with a possible exception of elderly, but it really showed up among married women. What's interesting to me this time is to see a continuation of that in the data. I don't know if that's a sort of reflection, a continued reflection that somehow the Democratic Party isn't sort of attuned to the needs of conventional families and traditional families. There was talk earlier in the year about security moms, so maybe that's part of it. But I'd like to actually think about this. I think it's a good research topic. What is happening to women? There also might be some very simple demographic explanations. Aging of the baby boom, lower salience of issues like abortion. There might be all sorts of things that are impacting this, and I think we just don't know it yet, but I think it's very serious.
And where do you think the Democratic Party goes from here?
I think we have to have a discussion about how we got to be the party of immorality and godlessness. I mean, this is not a great way to be a political party, to represent.
You accept that conclusion?
Yeah, well, you kind of have, put it this way, all year long, some of you know I've been the Democrat on Fox. And I've been getting these emails and these letters, and I'll go on Fox, which is watched, of course, by Republicans and conservatives. I'll go on and I'll talk about something completely, non-controversial, like voter turnout or, provisional ballots and what they mean. And I'll get emails from people who talk about morality, God, and things that I'm just stunned that they're reading into what the 2 minutes I just said on something that I don't think had much to do with it. So I did catch you, Alex, saying earlier about Johnny Apple's piece, not getting this. I kind of got this by the time this happened over and over and over again, I thought, wow, something is going on out there. And when you appear on television as a Democrat, there's a certain portion of the population who then makes the assumption that you are godless. And for a practicing Roman Catholic, this was kind of shocking.
Listen, I get emails from both sides accusing me of being immorality.
People could remember that a number of the Republicans get these emails in which they're heartless, or they're cold, or they're vicious people. I mean, they get that kind of counter thing. It's just that if you're not getting both, you assume it's your own.
Okay, floor is open. To join in this conversation, please, Sarah, why don't you come? Please identify yourself, and we'll have continue the conversation.
My name is Sarah Chase. I am an alum of the Kennedy School. And my question for the panel has to do with the connection between moral values and primal fear. I'm thinking about 9/11 and the reverberations that may still be present in the voting population, and how perhaps the primal fear that was aroused by 9/11 might, in a way, be linked to values, because quote-unquote moral values make things very simple, very black and white, and everything was so confused, among other things, that I wonder if you think there might be a
primal
connection.
fear, in effect, fosters a greater sensitivity, awareness, or concern for moral values.
Yeah, I mean, again, you've been speaking so much about moral values, but it might be just like the need for simplification, that moral values might be a proxy for.
Like us against them.
Yeah.
I don't think it's just simplification. To me, moral values provide us an element of psychic certainty, of security. And so it may be related to that the challenge to us is this is something we can hold on to and have security about when it looks like other things that we had presumed would be secure are not. So moral values, in my judgment, is not a matter of simplification, though that sometimes they're trashed for being overly simple. Some people are overly simple in their exercise of moral values, and I believe you have to apply your intelligence to them, but that's...
I'm not sure in your question which is the cause and which is the effect. But, you know, going up to the election, about the only issue that the president was clearly ahead on was leadership, right? So the economy was with the senator, and the war was with the senator, but leadership was with the president. And the president, whether you agree with him or not, is a very resolute fellow, right? I mean, he has a very clear sense of what he thinks is right and wrong. And I think that people's anxiety about terror and their comfort with his kind of resolute leadership on that issue had a big effect. And I also think, as Elaine touched on in the end of her comments, that may have had an effect on the security moms coming over, because that fear about their children, you know, and terror caused them to come over to the president's side. So I think fear and leadership had a large part to play.
Yeah. Before you start, tell us, you were in Broward County this past summer and worked for the Cheney-Bush side, and I wanted to. This conversation about morality and churches and that sort of, could you say just a bit about your organizing and what was going on the Republican side with regard to the churches? And before you ask your question, you might just identify yourself and just say a bit about that.
Yes, sir. My name is Joe Guzman. I'm a master's in public policy, second-year student. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Goldsmith. I commend your courage for coming into the lion's den here with me. Thank you. And regarding the organizing, I was in Broward County, and today in class we were discussing how, as part of our reporting up to the headquarters for the Bush-Cheney campaign, we had numbers of phone calls made, number of doors knocked, and it was a daily thing to how many churches did you visit, how many priests did you talk with, how many services did you go to start organizing. So it wasn't a new thing when we came to the churches at the end of the campaign.
You were doing this during the summer. You were doing this last summer.
Over the summer, and there was a continuous practice of this 72-hour training, the 3 days before the election. How are we going to get out our base? And it was a very well-oiled machine, and it came out for us in the end. My question is to the panel. So that we don't continue being on the outskirts here at the Kennedy School, what do you recommend the administration do at the Kennedy School of Government to teach the students about this big red America that really exists, these people that we're going to be leading? It's our mission to be leaders in this democratic society, but how can we lead them if we don't know them? So what is the administration going to do to teach us about it? Thank you.
Can I respond to that?
Please.
I think you're quite right. I think that is absolutely essential to the Kennedy School, and I think it's essential to the country. I can tell you, based on my own efforts to attract people from the Republican side of the aisle to an event that we hosted here just a couple of weeks ago, that I got repeated declines. Now, people didn't say, you know, I'm not going to go to the Kennedy School because it's the Kennedy School. I don't know whether they felt that way. I'm projecting, but I don't know. One of the people I asked, for instance, was Steve. He was occupied. I know he would have done it if he could. I don't mean to suggest that he didn't. But I think there is no question that among Republicans, the Kennedy School of Government is the lion's den, as you described it. And I think that we've got to find a way to bring them here, because I think our ignorance is overwhelming, and I think that we need to do something about it.
Our ignorance.
Ignorance.
I wasn't sure whether you were talking about the administration in Washington or the administration here. I assume you mean the administration here, because I think the obligation is on us. It's not what they need to teach us. The obligation
Kennedy
is on
School administration, absolutely.
Yeah, okay, because that obligation is ours, kind of thing. And if we haven't done as good a job as we should at the IOP, I want you to know very clearly it is our firm desire to do that and to bring in speakers. And while we run into a little of the difficulties that Alex said, I don't want to overstate that. We do have speakers who wonder whether or not they will be not just challenged, they're quite up to taking the challenge of questions, but whether or not they'll be shouted down or something of that sort. And it's part of our obligation is to make it very clear to people, we have very strong rules in this forum about free speech and the defense of that for the speaker that is invited, and to provide respect for them. We cannot guarantee that from every individual in the audience, but we've had people carried out of here when they don't behave that way, because it is an obligation, and that is a requirement of Harvard University and a requirement of the Kennedy School, and we administer that here in the forum. So there are a variety of things, but we have to reach out. But I agree with you. I come from the Midwest. I grew up and and in many ways still am a red state person, even though I admit I voted blue. But the point is that it is partly of having, if you believe in the values of tolerance, if you believe in the value of open-mindedness, then you don't start by closing off, belittling and not understanding other parts of the country.
And if I can follow up quickly, it's not just token speakers that we need, though, sir.
No,
we need
you're
faculty.
Right.
We need constant training about these values here.
Yeah, right. This is a...
I agree.
Does anybody else want to respond to this, by the way? I want to jump in. As you know, I think we should be continuing this conversation in a very aggressive way about sort of how to do this. I do think that the way you recruit people to come as students makes a difference in what your conversation is. And that the inclusion, for example, of national security fellows here at the school has been a substantial step forward and ensuring that students who come here have an exposure and a daily interaction with people who are active duty military, and in turn active duty military get to know the folks who are floating around here. I think that's been a huge plus for us. And that we ought to be looking for additional ways to do that. But I would also suggest to you that this school is not unique about this in that challenge. There are a large number of Republicans at the leadership positions that I've talked to in Washington who feel the academy as a general proposition is floating off into bluedom and doesn't understand very well who they are or what they do, and that there's almost a that if you're in the academy, almost by definition, you're against us and don't understand us. And that gulf is one that needs to be addressed. Just as the military is worried about its gulf from the civilian community, we really need to address that as well.
If I could just add, there's also a lack of knowledge within the Kennedy School community about the Kennedy School community. And it's intense, and the gulfs are big here. We have had a national security program here that has been of worldwide fame and work in both Republican and Democratic administrations for 30 years. And they are people that get invited to discuss with the CIA, regardless of who the President of the United States is, what's going on here. It's just that most people don't kind of know that goes on. It's the same with, I mean, they don't interact with our national security fellows, which have been around since I was here in the 90s. My point is there's lots of that going on. There needs to be more of it, but we need to do a better job within this. Many outsiders think that we don't have real economists here. Well, that's just nonsense. Most of our economists are very pro-market and not for just willy-nilly interventions in the marketplace, and yet the outside label is as if they were sort of socialists who really don't believe in markets. So there's a lot of misunderstanding because they misunderstand academic freedom, and what goes on one classroom is not what goes on in the other one necessarily.
But there is, let's be fair about this. I mean, when you look at the giving to one side or the other, and you look at the Harvard faculty, you know, sort of comes up on a list number 2 in the country as percentage of gifts went to one side versus the other, second only to Berkeley. Why didn't we win that? I don't understand why. But there is that perception that I think you're addressing that is a concern to a lot of folks on the panel and beyond.
I think it's a wonderful thing. It guarantees my indispensability.
It does indeed.
This is like permanent job
Thank you.
security for Steve,
Yeah,
right?
Please.
Hi, my name is Mariam Barhush, and I'm an MPP2 here at the Kennedy School. I think last week or a few days ago, they had a few polls that came out from different countries in the world, and I think with the exclusion of Iraq, President Kerry was elected according to populations in other countries by like 80% or 70%. So I mean, regardless of how accurate these polls are, there's definitely a general sentiment in the world of America being alienated from the rest of the world, and a lot of people blame Bush for this. So my question is what does a re-election by the American people of Bush say to other populations in the world?
That they're not voters here. I know that's a flip answer.
I got a call from a journalist from El Salvador who essentially asked a similar question. He said, what is going to happen in the United States now? How are people who were for Kerry going to deal with this? And I said, well, they're going to have to cope with it. And he said, well, what about the rest of the world? And I said, they're going to have to cope with it too. I mean, that's just the facts. And I think that I have no doubt that George W. Bush does not want to be an international pariah. And I think that he is doing things that he probably didn't get enough credit for trying to reach out and make connections in ways that were not so fraught with failure as the ones seeking alliances toward Iraq. But I think that is going to be a really big issue for his second term. I would imagine that. But frankly, Steve, what do you think? Do you think that's going to be a priority of the Bush administration?
Well, it's hard to answer either the question you asked or the one Alex asked in this sense. No president sets out to antagonize other countries. This president has a very clear sense of what he thinks America needs to do to defend itself, and if that requires him to take action unilaterally or preemption, he will do that. So I would anticipate that he would try to repair these relationships until the point that he views them as inconsistent with what he thinks is important for America. And then it will make a difference to do what he thinks is right for America. So it's hard to see how it'll play out, I think.
Yeah, let me just add to this. In my judgment, had Senator Kerry won, the Republicans, and there would have been a sense that the sort of the neoconservative approach to foreign policy had somehow been rejected, and that there would have been a lot of blame attached by some Republicans to some of the leading neocons with regard to how we got into Iraq and the aftermath. But that the victory flips that, and that when Vice President Cheney says we got a mandate, he was talking about more than the domestic side. And that I know one of his leading strategists told me a short while ago that if we win this, we will regard that as a mandate for, quote, an aggressive foreign policy. That does not mean they're necessarily going to go into Iran tomorrow, but it does mean that they feel they will interpret this as a vote, and particularly given the size of the popular vote margin, that they will interpret this as a endorsement, a national endorsement of what they have been doing and how they have tried to protect the country from terrorism, including the war in Iraq, and that they will interpret that as that the decision to go to war in Iraq was one that the country basically supports. Perhaps we made some mistakes in how we executed it, but that the policy of preemption is one that now has the country's support. And I think that those in Europe who were saying, well, we love Americans, we just don't like President Bush, are now going to have these questions about, gee, we didn't really understand that Americans actually like what the president is doing. And that's going to be an issue for conversation.
Is also going to create some serious tensions within the Republican Party, but my impression is that a number of senators, a number of House members who have started to raise questions about the management of the Iraq War were actually constrained because it was a Republican president facing an election, and I'm wondering if they won't be somewhat less constrained if they think that the mandate is interpreted to do more of that kind of same thing. In other words,
he will find it a lot
where it's gonna
easier,
go.
for example, with 55 votes in the Senate, to appoint some people to national security positions who will be, I would think, I don't think he'll feel, if he lost seats in the Senate, I think he might have gone more to the middle had he won, but gaining seats in the Senate gives him a cushion on his appointments.
Yeah, sure.
Don't you think?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, look, absolutely. And, let's go back to the Europeans for a minute. There's a lot of people who were in the government in the Clinton years who watched the complete abdication of responsibility for what was happening in Bosnia on the part of NATO. NATO and the European allies, they were inept. They could not act. And when there was really genocide going on in their backyard and massive instability, et cetera. So that kind of leads to this feeling that we've got to do it. That's why we've got to do it. And this sort of arrogance that I think that some of us see with the Bush administration thinking, well, nobody else can do it. We've got to do it. One of the effects of this might be for Europe to take a look at itself and perhaps, look, they've been promising to build a force for a decade now, and they've never put any money behind it. They're not doing it, okay? That we do everything we do all the heavy lifting that needs to be done there. This may in fact spur the creation of a different kind of Europe. Otherwise, Graham Allison has a great description of the world situation. There's a bus. The United States is the bus driver. And everybody else is in the back complaining. But we're driving the bus. Until there's another bus, the rest of the world is going to have to figure out how to deal with us. And I think that that's one of the things that this election even makes stronger.
They can get off the bus.
Yeah, what?
They can get off the bus.
They can get off the bus or they can get their own bus.
Please.
Good evening. My name is Dan Richenthal. I'm a third-year student at the law school. Sorry. My name is Dan Richenthal. I'm a third-year student at Harvard Law School. I want to return to something we talked about earlier. When the panel was talking about moral values, it seemed to talk specifically about issues, about gay marriage, about partial birth abortion, about other abortion issues. I wonder if it's actually more an issue of leadership, something you touched on, and less an issue of moral value A, moral value B, moral value C, and more an issue of how you see the world, that is a more instinctual, religious-based kind of leadership, a more moral value-based leadership in terms of how you speak, how you approach issues, and less checking a box on gay marriage or against gay marriage.
An interesting question. You've been talking about that.
Yeah, it was a very insightful question. I think it's this aggregation of those that created what many voters viewed as an imbalance between the candidates. I don't think it was a check the box. I mean, David asked me a question earlier about gay marriage. I think because it was on the ballot, it tended to be a catalyst for people coming out. But I think that they hear the president's language and they see his position on certain issues, and they look to the leadership question, and it's that package of traits that helps them form their opinion. And there are a large number of Americans, as we all know, this is a particularly religious country, and so that colors how they think of their leader, right? And I remember what the poll numbers were, but the percentage of people who want their elected leader to be religious is really high. It's more than 3/4 or something. And so I think all that together combined to kind of affect the election.
Do you think it also goes to, if I might, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this question of fact-based or evidence-based leadership versus almost faith-based, in which you sort of respond more to your sense of what's morally right and wrong, and you have an intuitive sense of the world. That came out of that New York Times piece in the magazine section that was so controversial just before the election, and there was some discussion of this issue. Do you find that among Republicans that there is a distinction between, okay, you guys can go out and get all your social science research and you get all your facts together and you can make your public policy pronouncements, which have no reference to right and wrong, but we're going to do this on a somewhat different basis, and we do this from a faith perspective. Do you think there is a difference in the way Republicans today sort of treat or think about public policy decisions? And I think this is where you were going.
That's absolutely where I'm going. I think there's examples. You can think about the estate tax. It seems that Republicans look at that as an issue almost in moral terms. You should not be taxed at death. Democrats seem to look at it almost more deductively. That is, if we take away the estate tax, the following 3 things happen, and that's bad, and here's why we should keep it. Maybe that's a poor example, maybe foreign policy is a better example, but I think it's exactly what I was asking about.
I wouldn't, you may be right, I wouldn't want to overdo this. I mean, in this sense. The Republican Party has, we're a little more monolithic than the Democrat Party, but there are differences, right? There are economic conservatives and there are social conservatives, and here and there are people who aren't conservative. Not very many, but they're out there as well. And I don't think every issue translates itself into a black and white moral issue, or, agreeing that people have different views about what that is. But many do, right? Many big issues translate into those moral issues. But the questions that we're going to face that are okay, so many of them roll up into this leadership question. We've exhausted that, I think. It's a very good point on your part. But the big intractable issues where Kennedy's school analysis and the common views between Elaine and me could play a part, just as symbolically, is on, how do you fix Social Security? How do you fix Medicaid? These economic issues are not unimportant in this administration, the next 4 years, and I don't think they translate themselves to black and white religious issues. So I just don't want to get too far down this line.
Can I just add one thing? Because this goes back to the earlier discussion, and I think the dialogue sort of illuminates what I was trying to say. That if we're going to, that morality needs to be very broadly defined, and my morality to me is as important, and I believe I'm as moral person as somebody who's on the quote other side, trying to argue that. So I'm trying to say, and I guess I'm not saying it very clearly, is let's pull that out of our politics and try to talk about things where we can make progress on for the country as a whole. I just don't see where the dialogue takes us, where we keep arguing about our moral values, as if, and as you've pointed out so many times tonight, that as if they have the moral values and we don't.
Yeah.
One of the things that you said earlier today, I think, really gets to it. You said there is no political solution to the disagreement about values.
Right.
This is not something that lends itself to kind of a political solution. Whereas there are questions, Social Security and Medicare and things that are serious ones, that lend themselves to political solutions.
Let's talk about those.
And those
We
are the
have real
ones
work to
that
do.
we can solve. We can't solve these.
Yeah, but I want to go back.
I think this misunderstands a very important part about politics. A lot of what goes on in politics is symbolic. It is an expression of who we are as a people, what we identify with, whether we feel comfortable with the nation we're a part of or the community we're a part of. So it makes this very relevant, and it's one of the reasons the president was successful, because he captured that for a lot of people better than Democrats did. So I don't want to leave the impression, I don't think that's very significant. It's just there are other things as well, and some issues don't. I mean, after all, the great things that actually seemed to help the Democratic Party in the 60s and the 70s was the moral drive, because it was more willing to lead on civil rights and more willing to lead on women's rights. These were grand moral issues. I mean, all the Kennedy School analysis in the world couldn't tell you whether or not they could tell you how many blacks were not getting schooling, but then it was a moral judgment of whether you believe the federal government ought to step in and override the state governments and override 150 years of tradition of states' rights. I mean, that was a moral issue.
But Phil, as Elaine pointed out when she sat down, standing up for women's rights now is now viewed as an immoral position.
Well, some people see it that way.
That's why we have to. There's no resolution to this. That's why we have to find another way to talk about our policy.
Well, I'm not sure. I think that in the end, your perspective, I'm presuming on this, is actually going to win out if they ever get it. When you get down to practical ways, you try to say that we're now going to go back to restricting what women can be a part of, and I think you will see a rising up and a very quick shift in the number of women that are wherever they are, and a lot of men too.
Under the umbrella of moral values.
This is why Senator Kerry lost, right here, because you see, there are these divisions in the Democrat Party to my left here, right?
There are some in the Republican
we are
Party
just
as well.
yeah.
What I'm suggesting is the ones in the Republican Party are going to come out in spades if they're not very careful in how they lead over the next 4 years.
Yeah, but your point, you raised the question of the estate tax, and I think it's an extremely good example. Ian Shapiro has been the dean or chair of the political science department at Yale. Has got a book coming out on this subject, on estate tax abolition, that movement. And what he argues is that a lot of Democrats started looking at this and say, well, maybe we could tinker with it and we'll raise the exemption. And then the Republicans came along and said, we don't want to tinker with this and adjust it here and adjust it that. We think it's immoral. So we have to get rid of the whole thing. And they jumped in their public policy view toward this from compromise, where are you going to adjust it, to let's get rid of it. And they have actually created a movement that claims to have this sort of moral passion behind it to get rid of it. And it's been a very interesting development, and when they're winning. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, they're winning. They're getting the votes from the Black Caucus to do that. But it's all because they reframed it in these moral terms. It's been extraordinarily interesting public policy example of exactly what I think you were aiming at. It's very, very interesting. Let's go over here. We've only got a few minutes. 5 minutes, we're out of here.
Sure. My name is Andrew Stober. I'm a MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. Was yesterday the big dividend from a long investment in a social movement? And if it was a dividend, is this just maybe the first or second one after 1994? Or was this the climax and it's now going to start going down?
On a downward trend here.
I don't know. The country, I mean, just look at what happened. So the youth vote it was Senator Kerry's, not as huge as he expected. African Americans were 9-1. Jewish voters are about, I'm a Republican Jew. My minority within a minority jumped from 19 to 24. It was a huge increase. Hispanic vote is, will be the interesting battleground going forward. But the country is more religious than it was before. So I think it would be a mistake to say that this issue we've been discussing has crested and you can just watch it abate. I don't think that will be the case.
Last question.
My name is Angel Pascual Ramsey. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School.
What?
I want to ask...
Where are you from?
I'm Spanish.
Okay.
I knew you were going to ask me that. I want to ask the members on the panel that would consider themselves to be on the left, or liberals, why are you so defeatist? Why, in the face of what many on your camp have described as the most momentous election in a generation, when the stakes were so high, and you have been confronted with policies which, if you had seen them 10 years ago, you would have considered them almost unacceptable. Why are we not taking a page from the leaf of the conservatives, who, when 30 years ago found themselves in the same situation, they did not react by trying to compromise, trying to be more liberal. They actually found ways of pursuing the same objectives, but intelligent ways. They used religion, they used morality as a way of capturing the vote from the working class. Why don't we try to be imaginative in trying to pursue our objectives, as opposed to just keep compromising as we've been doing for the last 20 years? Why doesn't progressive America wake up and fight? And if you're not doing so for a reason, can you tell me why?
I assume you're directing that at me?
I mean, you say it's not, you shouldn't exaggerate these things. He pins all his hopes on moderate Republicans giving Bush a tough time.
I think that we're misinterpreting the election in a lot of ways tonight, but I think one of the ways that we're misinterpreting it is not assuming that John Kerry fought a very aggressive election. I think that he was very competitive. He fought in the debates. What we tend to do in American elections is, once there's a judgment by the voters, then we overinterpret both the victory and the defeat.
Do you think we've overinterpreted the victory? Was not that big a deal?
I mean,
is that your view? It wasn't
yes,
that big
but
a deal.
you were arguing.
I know. I agree.
It was a major victory.
I agree.
Yeah.
I do argue it was very significant.
And I'm arguing that it was much closer. I think 3.5 million votes is a good margin, and I don't want to take anything away from that. But I think that we basically still have a tied electorate, and we still have the same issues that we had yesterday.
So your view is the Democratic Party does not need to go through a serious reassessment?
I'm trying to argue something else. I mean, that's why I keep talking about my values, right? Or I'm talking about we need to be more aggressive about the things that we believe in. That's what I'm trying to say, and I call those moral values. So we're in a way the discussion reflects what I'm calling an asymmetry in the election itself. The Republican voters believed it was about one thing. The Democratic voters believed that it was about another thing. It was a very competitive election. John Kerry was a very strong candidate. He fought a terrific fight, and we are still at it. And it isn't that we've suffered a major defeat. I guess that's what you're trying to get me to say.
If your party loses 5 out of 7 presidential elections, you don't read anything into that?
Well, how about looking at, we lost, it's only been 4 years since we were in power for 8 years. So, I mean, I don't think that we're on this trajectory downward that we need to do a major overhaul. I think that John Kerry articulated, if we're a party that's pro-education, strongly questioning the nature of our international engagements, and I'm not saying anti-war because I don't think that I don't think John Kerry would agree with that, but I mean, sort of whatever those nuanced positions are, health, Social Security reform, health care, all the things that we stand for. There's nothing to be ashamed of in that, and I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of in the race that John Kerry won, just because he lost.
I'm saying the word shame was not in the conversation. It was a question of whether you.
But the question was, why are we so defeatist?
Okay.
I don't feel defeat. I don't feel like I've. That I need to apologize for that race.
I don't feel defeatist either, but I think that it's also the day after we got shellacked, and that's the fact. But I think that you raised an important point, and I think that it's one that bears a direct answer. I think what you suggest would be catastrophic for the Democratic Party, in my opinion, for it to veer strongly to the left, for it to take as its mandate from this to abandon the center and to veer to the left, framing it in the most, imaginative and hopeful terms. Because I think that our country is a different country. I don't think that has ever worked very well here. And the single exception was Franklin Roosevelt, who revolutionized the country in the midst of a depression. But the most successful Democratic candidate and president, certainly in recent history, has been Bill Clinton. And Bill Clinton found a way to have the values of the Democratic Party framed in ways that made it appealing to the middle of the country plus the left. And I think that has to be the solution for the Democratic Party. What I fear most is that the Democratic Party is going to split in two, with the left wing saying, we tried it your way, didn't work, we're out of here. If that happens, then I think that the Democratic Party's prospects of regaining any ground that they have lost are almost nil.
Lane, last word.
I think that there is actually a structural problem with the Democratic Party, and it goes to the fact that this is a very different economy than the economy that we had for most of the 20th century. And we still don't quite understand the dynamics of this economy or how to pursue the traditional democratic values of equality and the social safety net in the context of this economy, not the last economy. So what happens is, and it happened all the time in the Clinton White House, is, you know, we'd be around the table discussing some policy or another, or some problem, and somebody would come up with a kind of standard left-wing solution, and it would be instantly booed down, not for political reasons, but because it simply didn't fit the reality of the economy anymore. I don't think this is a problem, by the way, just for the United States. I think this is a problem for left of center politics all over the free world, which is that the old socialist basis is simply gone, obsolete, and counterproductive in this new world. I think actually sometime in the next decade, the Democrats will come back, and I believe that they will come back when they have created a social safety net for the 21st century, for the information economy. And right now, too many Democrats are holding on to the safety net of the industrial economy, and it isn't making anybody very happy, and frankly, it's not very compelling politics. But I do think that there's a lot of work to be done on this, and we haven't really thought this through yet, and there's some very hard decisions to be made. But I think a lot of this is actually structural. We had, since Franklin Roosevelt, we had a Democratic Party with an economic policy backed by certain values that kind of made sense in one kind of economy. That economy is gone, and it's not coming back. And until we really confront that and think about this new economy, we won't know what progressive politics looks like.
I think Elaine is right, but I also think that historically, if you look at it, usually parties don't just come back to power because they were so creative and ingenious and suddenly came up with it. It's because the governing party fails. Fundamentally, we decide that we are happy with what's there as long as things work. When they start not to work, then we get unhappy with them. So fundamentally, the opposition wins as those in power. And my only suggestion, the theme was not that moderate Republicans are the savior for the Democratic Party. It's just that I hope they are very successful in governing this country well in Iraq and elsewhere, but it isn't going to be easy. It's not going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, this conversation could clearly continue, but this, after all, is only day one in the post-election period. In the meantime, it's good to be able to come together as a community and have this kind of discussion. And I think we ought to be particularly grateful to this panel for coming and sharing this evening with us. Thank you all.